Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Helen Namisi, and I am the Vice Chair of the LSK Nairobi branch. On behalf of the branch and our Chair, Eric Theory, I'd like to invite you to today's webinar. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here today with us. We are very pleased to be able to welcome you to the Lawyer's Role in Climate Change and Human Rights webinar, which is brought to you by the LSK Nairobi in collaboration with the Climate Change Lawyers Cafe. And as you will note, this webinar could not have come at a better time, considering that today is the last day of the UN Conference on Climate Change, COP26. So before we get started, I'd like to recognize the efforts of Immaculate Kamonto, who also happens to be our moderator this afternoon. And Immaculate has worked tirelessly to bring together this amazing panel of individuals from all over the globe. You'll have an opportunity to interact with them, and they will be able to tell you what they have for us. And it is my hope that we'll be able to learn and appreciate the lawyer's role in climate change and in protection of the environment and human rights. I know that for most of the time when we think about law, we do not actually relate it or cannot relate it to climate change. And therefore, most of us fail to understand or be able to connect how lawyers also play a role in climate change. And so I am looking forward to a very good session, a very interactive session with all of us. I would like to ask all of us to maintain webinar etiquette, which includes muting your microphones unless you are actually addressing one of the speakers, and then reserve your questions till the end. You may also use the chat section in case you have a burning question which you feel you will forget by the end of the session. And then I do not wish to take too much time. We have a very tight schedule. We have amazing speakers, lady speakers, I must add. I am very excited about that. And now I hand it over to Immaculate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I mean, we could not have had a better introduction. Thank you very much. And I must acknowledge the willingness of the Law Society of Kenya Nairobi branch to collaborate and partner on this event. So thank you very much. So let's going on. My name is Immaculate Kemunto. I'm an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Also the founder of the Climate Change Cafe. The Climate Change Cafe is a Pan-African platform for all lawyers interested to learn about climate change. Our mission is to enhance a lawyer's role in climate change. So why does it matter? Why are we here today? Since the 1800s, that's during the industrial era, the global average temperature has increased by about 1.2 degrees Celsius by as of 2020. And with that increase of just 1.2 degrees Celsius, I believe we've all seen heard in the news, seen in the news, the devastating effects global warming has had, especially on Africa. So in 2015, world countries converged and passed the Paris Agreement, where they committed to keep the global warming temperatures well below 2 degrees. Because science, according to science, it's unthinkable of what to even imagine what will happen to us if we exceed 2 degrees. So according to a report by UNEP, 2016, 2019, 2020, and I think 1998 been recorded to be one of the hottest years on record since 1800. And recently, we've seen cyclones, we're seeing persistent droughts in parts of Africa. I believe we are aware of Cyclone Idai and Kenneth, which completely devastated Mozambique. Loss of lives, loss of property, flooding. We are aware of the drought crisis in northern and coastal parts of Kenya, which is getting worse by the year. The threats to food security and all that. So in 2021, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international scientific body that monitors climate change, issued a report indicating more cyclones, heat waves, more floods, more droughts projected, especially for Africa. And according to the report, Africa is bearing the brunt of the climate change and global warming. Despite Africa's contribution to climate change being very minimal, but unfortunately, we are shouldering a big part of the impacts of climate change. So all is not lost, and that's why we're here today. We're seeing amazing campaigns, advocacy efforts towards combating climate change, towards climate justice, and climate mitigation. So as Helen said, today marks the end of the COP26. COP26 is a conference of parties. It's the biggest decision-making body. It's essentially a meeting of all the states party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'd like to read to you a statement by the United Nations High Commissioner to COP26. So she says, without a healthy climate to live on, there will be no human rights. And if we continue on our current path, there may be no humans. She continues to say, the triple threat on climate change, pollution, and loss of biodiversity constitute the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. And it's so unfortunate that all these three threats are human-made, they're anthropogenic. So governments have a duty, and governments and other duty bearers, especially the business world, have a duty to prevent, mitigate, and remedy the effects of climate change. So we've had very interesting and encouraging developments across internationally regarding climate change. And I think our next speaker will speak on. Our first speaker is Teresa Anisen. Teresa is a human rights officer in the UN Human Rights Office. She's been working on climate change and environmental issues with the UN Human Rights Office since 2019. She's worked for the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, Switzerland since 2014. Prior to that, she worked for a number of civil society organizations on issues related to human rights, refugees, corruption, and environmental rights in Brazil, Italy, Norway, and Switzerland. So Teresa will take us through the international landscape on human rights, environmental rights, and climate change. Teresa, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Immaculate. And thank you to Helen as well for the nice introduction. I'm going to start by putting up my presentation. And I just beg you all to bear over with me so that I put it up correctly, because at the UN Secretariat, we usually don't use Zoom. So even if I've done my share of presentation online, I sometimes don't do it correctly with Zoom. So I will just please ask colleagues to confirm if they see a full screen presentation from my side.
Not yet, Therese. I'm seeing the folder from before.
You're seeing the folder from before. I'm sorry about that. Let me try to switch my screens here. Is that better?
Still not yet.
Okay, then bear over with me and I'll do this again. I'm very sorry to everyone who has to endure this tedious technicalities that you probably thought you were done with, because everyone's already learned to do this by now.
No, it's
I'm
okay.
trying again. I'm giving it a second shot. Are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Fantastic. Are you seeing it full screen without my notes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So thank you again, Immaculate, for inviting the UN Human Rights Office to this panel. I'm obviously really, really honored to be part of this. It is also thanks to my colleague, my Kenya-based colleague, Clarice Oganga, who suggested that we deliver this presentation from headquarters in Geneva, where I am part of a small team working on the intersection between climate change and human rights. I'm a little bit terrified to be speaking to you all today because differently from most of my colleagues, I'm not a lawyer, but I did spend the last 7 years working for the UN Human Rights Office. And I hope that what I share with you today will be of interest. Obviously, I'm very happy to take any questions or comments that you may have after my presentation. Immaculate has told me that I have okay, I get a comment about, I'm just going to switch my screens here so you hopefully can see my presentation better. Happy to take any comments or questions that you have afterwards. And what I would want to start out with, I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental issues as a chapeau for climate change and human rights issues, because as Immaculate just said, what we're facing is actually a triple planetary crisis. We have biodiversity loss, we have pollution, we have climate change. They're all human-made and they're all interlinked, so we cannot separate one from another anymore, and they all adversely impact on human rights. Okay, now it looks like everyone can see my screen properly, and if not, please take the floor, because sometimes I'm bad at monitoring the chat while I'm speaking. I really appreciate at the outset, Immaculate, you already shared a couple of quotes from the High Commissioner. In relation to the COP that's closing today, our High Commissioner is very vocal and very interested in working on climate change. It's one of her core issues, really. Even if, of course, she's promoting, working to promote and protect all human rights, she's really embraced the climate crisis as such, and we're very, very grateful for that in our team, because what the Secretary General has said, what the High Commissioner has said, what everyone is saying is this is really the crisis of our lifetime. Let me see if I can move on my slides now in this mode. What I just wanted to say at the outset, when we talk about climate change, we really talk about environmental action overall. And I hope my comments aren't too off, because I know many of you are experts on this issue, maybe all of you, but I'm giving it a try anyway. Just to say really what the human rights-based approach means in all of this. It's a question we also get from colleagues in our field. I mean, our office has presences, we're present in over 80 countries, and of course not all of our colleagues have different expertise, and not all of them feel like they are climate change or environmental experts. So this is really a question that often is coming up, the links between human rights and climate change, and it's very easily demystifiable, because the human rights-based approach to climate change is really not different from the human rights-based approach to anything else. It really consists in analyzing human rights obligations, inequalities, vulnerabilities. It anchors the responsibilities with states, and as was already mentioned, also business actors. And it really is anchored in accountability and transparency, and key to all of this: participation, access to information, and access to justice. So again, spelling it out here, identifying rights holders and their elements is key to this approach. And then to identify the duty bearers and their obligations under international human rights law, and to then embed all of these human rights principles in environmental action. And what we like to say is that environmental action, climate action, any sort of action, it is not sustainable. You will not have good results if you don't have a human rights-based approach. This applies to government policies. It applies even to the UN's own programs and policies. If you don't have a people-centered approach, if you don't know who you are making your policies for, then how can you meet their needs? So this is really key to the human rights-based approach. I think I've already said some of what's on these slides. I'm not going to go into them in much detail. We talk about the right to a healthy environment. And as was recognized at the Human Rights Council just earlier, now in October this year, there was actually a resolution, I think many of you are already aware of, really recognizing the global right to a safe, we don't say safe anymore because France took that out of the resolution. We say clean, healthy, and sustainable environments. And what that means to people, what that means for the climate, biodiversity, ecosystems, and a non-toxic environment. It's very clear. The right was in fact already recognized by more than 150 countries through national or regional legislations. So it's not something new, but this global level of recognition is a push towards trying to make this right available to everyone. So as I said, one component of the right to a healthy environment is a safe and stable climate, and we'll dwell a little bit more around climate afterwards. Healthy ecosystems, non-toxic environments, and here in particular where we're talking about pollution as really one of the biggest threats to health and to the right to life worldwide, and to justice and inclusion, as I was saying earlier, in terms of the human rights-based approach. Now, if we're focusing in a little bit more on the impacts of climate change, specifically on human rights, what we say at our office is that climate change basically poses a threat to the enjoyment of all human rights. Of course, there are some human rights that are more directly, more imminently, and already very strongly impacted in many places around the world. But I think it's about time for us all to realize that no one is going to be exempted from this. No one is really untouched by climate change. But some of the rights that have been also used in different court cases, that we also use an example emerging from our studies on this issue, is really most strikingly the right to life and the right to health, of course, and this is something that we increasingly see cited. But really the enjoyment of all human rights, it includes culture, and it includes the right to self-determination, the right to food, housing, the right to development. It's all impacted one way or another by both the slow and sudden onset effects that are caused or reinforced by climate change. And I certainly don't need to tell anyone on your continent about this. Africa is really at the forefront, bearing the brunt of the impacts, the negative impacts, and really without having contributed much to the origins of climate change in the first place. So what we say when we say that human rights, climate change is a human rights issue, we say this because under international human rights law, as you know, states, they have obligations and duties to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And that includes the obligation to protect people from foreseeable threats to the enjoyment of their human rights, like climate change. Very, very clear-cut case. Now, we have so much science and so much evidence about the impacts of climate change that I think this is, in most circles, no longer disputed. And what does that mean? It means that states have an obligation both to prevent and to address the adverse human rights impacts of climate change, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, and also providing means for people to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. As an example, we often frequently, in order to highlight the responsibilities of businesses, highlight the guiding principles of on business and human rights, endorsed by the Human Rights Council back in 2011. So we have a 10-year anniversary this year, who really affirm that states must protect against human rights abuses by businesses, and that business enterprises also have a responsibility to respect human rights and to do no harm. Talking a little bit more about the concrete impacts, I'm often asked to give examples. Some of the findings from our studies, which is I'll talk a little bit more about how they originated later, but it's a mix of desk research and even inputs received from member states, civil society, other UN agencies working on this issue as well. For example, older persons, and that includes in particular older persons with disabilities and older women, they are among those most affected by climate-related harms. As an example of sudden onset events here, during Hurricane Katrina in the US, 75% of those who died were over the age of 60. When we talk about gender differentiated impacts, it's really true that systemic and really entrenched discrimination leads to gender differentiated impacts, which impacts both the right to health, food security, livelihoods, human mobility, and many other things. And as you all know, of course, intersecting forms of discrimination make some women and girls more vulnerable to climate change. Another example that we like to use, which is really, really striking, is that, and we have numbers between 2008 and 2018, but it continues in the same trajectory, unfortunately. Each year, 24 million people were internally displaced by weather-related sudden onset disasters. And that's only the sudden onset ones. That doesn't count for the slow onset ones. And finally, again, talking about health, really extreme weather, but also changes in temperature are sort of the most direct impacts, but you also have these indirect impacts on your health that happens when there are changes to the natural systems that, for example, result in crop failure, expanding disease vectors, and so on and so forth. And very importantly, to add to the health impacts, is impacts on people's mental health. This is increasingly also well documented. As we've already said, the impacts of climate change are really disproportionately borne by people and communities that are already in vulnerable situations. And we really like to stress how these are not vulnerable people per se at the outset, but one becomes vulnerable by a series of economic and social constructs, and sometimes even political constructs. And that includes geography, poverty, gender, age, disability. Again, as I mentioned previously, can include cultural and ethnic background. And again, those who have contributed the least historically are really, really at the forefront, bearing the burst. I think that in terms of impacts, what we also like to do at the Human Rights Office is not just to victimize people, but also underline people's agency. And here is really the key of the human rights-based approach, is that the importance of participatory processes for climate decision making is really key to the human rights-based approach. People-centered, people's rights are at the center. And this part about where you lawyers come in, identifying the obligations of duty bearers, both states and businesses. And in all of this, we underline the need for international solidarity and cooperation, climate justice, of course, equality and non-discrimination, which is really at the core of human rights. And speaking of international solidarity and cooperation, it's also very visible in the COP negotiations as we see them unfold and hopefully conclude today or maybe tomorrow, as they tend to spill over. In particular, when we talk about climate finance and we talk about common but differentiated responsibilities to climate change. Again, I'm not going to go on and on about the procedural rights. You all know this. I thought I would speak just very, very briefly about what our office does in terms of climate action. I think many of you may be familiar with this already. We really work closely with civil society. We like to think we're one of the UN entities that work the closest with civil society, which we believe is really key to promote participation. Of course, we also work to assist human rights mechanisms that our office is supporting, and I will tell you more about their work in a couple of minutes. We do a lot of advocacy also in behalf of environmental human rights defenders, who include obviously those who are protecting and advocating for increased climate action. And we do research and advocacy, and that's part of what we do here in this branch that I and my team were part of. One case that is really pertinent to Kenya that I would like to highlight, if I may, and I just ask your colleagues to stop me if I'm going way over time, but I still think I have a few minutes left. Our office, together with UNEP, engaged in the case of Phyllis Umido and her community. And it's really a case that we like to show as a good practice of what the UN can achieve when it engages in supporting environmental human rights defenders. And in Phyllis' case, there were, it's really common to the environmental injustice and even environmental racism, as we would see in the United States, for example, where we have businesses, factories doing rather treating rather toxic substances, tend to allocate them both in developing and in developed countries. And of course, it also reflects on the bigger global scale and picture. Their dirtier business and the not completely legally compliant part of their businesses close to vulnerable communities, close to communities who are in vulnerable situations because they may not have adequate access to representation, to infrastructure, to participation, to means of livelihood, to absolutely the broad range of human rights as we speak. And we were delighted to see that with support of our office, the UNEP and probably many other civil society actors, last year there was a favorable ruling in the Land and Environment Courts. So this ruling really, in the end, really protected that community's right to health environments, and to water, and to life. And in upholding those rights, we really in a case against the government and two rather powerful companies. And of course, you know this context better than me, but what I can say, the type of intervention that colleagues did went from engaging with local authorities, police stations, calling, showing up, or when people were threatened, a child went missing. Lots of very serious things that happened in that case after Phyllis started taking legal action. UNEP, who work a lot on this public visibility and advocacy side, really paid off, and we'll be excited to see how this sets an example to follow. That was just one example of how we support environmental human rights defenders, and I really want to highlight that just because civic space and the promotion and protection of civic space is really key also in climate action. I wanted to talk a little bit now just about the developments at the Human Rights Council. The Council has really contributed to raising awareness of the links between human rights and climate change by a series of targeted clarifications on climate change impacts on human rights. It has done so through the adoption of a series of resolutions on climate change and human rights, those that we call the thematic resolutions. Now you also know that there's this dedicated resolution again at this last session of the Council in October that's set up a special rapporteur on climate change who will start, the mandate will start to take on work starting of March next year, because there's a nomination process and application process, and then next year we will see who that person is and what sort of work that person will be undertaking. But basically, the line of thematic resolutions on this issue goes back to 2008. And since then, okay, I get a message. I have 5 minutes left. Perfect. Thank you, Immaculate. Since then, after an additional set of resolutions that has generally clarified these linkages, we've done thematic work. So the resolutions at the Council then mandated our office to do this work on health, on children, on migrants, on gender, persons with disabilities, older persons, and persons in vulnerable situations, just to really go into depth and really demonstrate and document these impacts on different groups who may be in particularly vulnerable situations when it comes to climate change. I'm just going to go through those slides very quickly. As I said, the latest one, we're documenting impact on older persons, and I mentioned this example at the outset. When we talk about persons with disabilities, we know that 15% of the global populations live with a disability, and I think this is an important number to cite, because some of the feedback from states when one talks about protecting different groups in vulnerable situations is that states have capacity constraints and are unable to focus on special group. Well, here's a group that makes up 15% of the population. If you talk about women, 50-something% of the population. So really not a valid argument, even if of course we do know that everyone has capacity constraints. We know that by empowering women, even agricultural productivity would increase significantly. We already spoke about the number of people displaced, and that was only the people displaced internally by sudden onset events. We talk about children, in particular pollution. Of course, as you know, they're particularly exposed to pollution because of their unique metabolism. And we have 150 million children living in high-risk zones for tropical cyclones. And again, health pollution, 7 million deaths a year. We don't need to say anything more. I wanted to draw your attention to two other important recent issues before I conclude. We already spoke briefly about the resolutions on the right to health environment and the rights and the special rapporteur on climate change. But what I really wanted to share with you, and I'm checking my clock here, I have 1 minute left, I think. In terms of the jurisprudence emanating from the UN treaty bodies, from the human rights treaty bodies, they all have general recommendations and general comments, increasingly addressing climate change, environmental issues. So keep an eye out for those. It's really useful guidance for states on how to go about and interpreting the various articles or various provisions of the different covenants of the different treaties. And I won't be linking those. I can share that with you later in writing as well. But really, just last month, again, the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a decision in really what is a pioneer case, I would say. 16 children filed a petition against 5 governments. Kenya isn't one of them. I don't think Kenya has acceded to the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that would enable individuals' complaints, but certainly it would be something to advocate for all states to do this, because the states that have signed up to this were taken to the committee while you can say that the complaint was declared inadmissible because the youth hadn't exhausted domestic remedies. Still, the committee made the point that states can be held liable for extraterritorial human rights impacts related to climate change. And that was really the main issue that youth is calling for today: increased climate action, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and curbing carbon pollution. And the second case that I would like to highlight as well, and I'll be concluding with this, already back in 2019, there was the first human rights treaty body decision addressing the human rights impacts of climate change in a case called Teitiota versus New Zealand. And again, whilst the committee concluded that New Zealand had not violated the rights of this person, the right to life, as he claimed, in returning him to his to the Pacific Islands that he was a resident of, the committee still opened for that. The effects of climate change in receiving states may expose individual to violations of the rights under Articles 6 and 7 of the Covenant, so the right to life and the provisions related to torture and inhuman treatments, and thereby trigger the non-refoulement obligations of sending states. I'll stop here. You have the UPR as well. Kenya received a recommendation in 2020 related to climate change and impacts on women. I'd be happy to discuss much more, but I'll stop here. We have other very interesting panelists to listen to. Thank you so much for letting me present today, and I'll stay tuned and look for questions coming up later.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for that very informative and insightful presentation. I'm happy you mentioned the case of the 16 children, because I was going to bring that up. I also note you mentioned the issues of obligations on states in relation to climate change, and the various international avenues for asserting rights related to climate change, such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Committee, which gave the ruling. And you raised a very important issue, whether Kenya has acceded to the optional protocol. The answer to that is no. Unfortunately, Kenya has ratified so many human rights treaties, but we've not ratified the optional protocol that give the treaty bodies jurisdiction over cases that can be brought by individuals from Kenya. But I think maybe something to reflect on, and Teresa, you can come back on this, is what are other avenues? How can people use, let's say, this the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, and for Kenya specifically, the right to a clean, safe and sustainable, clean, healthy and sustainable environment now. Fortunately, it's embedded in the African Charter on Human Rights. So individuals can actually take complaints on that, on climate change issues, to the African courts, of course, through the African Commission. So coming closer home, our next speaker is Jacqueline Ngutia Onyango. She's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and she currently works as a regional coordinator at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. She undertakes investigations, strategic litigation, awareness creation, and monitoring on the observance of human rights by the state. She's previously worked as the Advocates for International Development and FIDA, and is an ardent supporter of application of human rights-based approach in development and programming. Jacqueline, please go ahead.
Thank you, Immaculate, and thank you, colleagues, for creating time to join this wonderful session. Therese, thank you so much for the presentation at the global level. Mine will focus more on the country level, what the government has done and what the role of lawyers is in terms of promoting climate action. When I was sharing this particular, the link to the webinar, one of a friend called and told me, Jackie, are you going to show us polar bears? He felt that climate change only affects the Arctic people and is not here in Africa. And yesterday, if you all watched news, there was an article about the government moving schools from Baringo because of the rising water levels. And I called him and told him that is climate change. And he told me he'll be here. I'm happy to see his name here. I hope he'll now understand that climate change is not just for the polar bears, but everyone in the world. So I don't want to speak much about the background which has been advanced by Therese and Immaculate, what climate change has done for us as a human. And the unfortunate bit is that climate change is the making of the human beings themselves, though it still affects both human and non-human beings within the world. I'll start off with this very interesting picture. What has nature contributed to the people? And I was able to identify this is an excerpt from a report on these issues of climate change. Nature's contribution to the people, threefold. Provision, we get our food, we get our fresh water, fuel, and all things from nature. It again regulates itself, the climate, flood, diseases, water pollution, issues about culture, aesthetics, spiritual stuff, educational materials, even recreational. And lastly, supporting us as human beings in terms of example, like primary production of our daily needs, soil formation, nutrient cycling. So basically, the nature is able to give us food, housing, water, and so many other human needs that we do require for our rights to be realized. So there is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its resolution 41 of 2021. It highlights a number of human rights violations that occur when there is climate change. And Therese has mentioned a number. And when you look at these human rights, which include right to life, self-determination, health, food, water, and sanitation, they are recognized, they are legally recognized human rights, not only under the international human rights instruments, but also regional and also within our constitution. So some of those international and regional human rights instruments include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a soft law, it's not binding. We also have the ICSR, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which would focus on issues such as self-determination, right to life. Within Africa, we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and we have seen at the African Commission certain decisions coming out of that, of the commission that would then advance issues of human rights, and I would ask, environmental rights, and I would urge all of us to create time and read the Ogoni case, quite progressive decision from the African Court. We have CEDAW and CAT, those are few international and regional human rights instruments. So those that are related to climate change, I don't want to repeat them, but they are highlighted there. We have the UNFCCC, one on desertification, and also on biological diversity. There are those that are also soft laws, there are those that are binding. And we have one by those who are in this sector, NOx, the Framework Principles on Human Rights and Environment of 2018. I will also urge us to go through that particular document. It does, those who are again in the environmental sector understand that issues of environmental rights are threefold. One, substantive obligations. Those are substantive rights that comprise of the actual rights such as clean and healthy environment, but we also have procedural obligations. Those procedural rights, those are the rights that help us achieve the substantive rights. For example, freedom of expression, and also public participation, access to effective remedies, so that if you don't have procedural rights, then you're not able to realize the substantive rights. And lastly, the protection of the very vulnerable people, which the rest has mentioned. So again, within the human rights sphere, we know that the government has a role to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And when we talk of respecting human rights, the government is expected to refrain from interfering or limiting anyone's rights. The obligation to protect requires the government to protect individuals or groups against human rights violations by others or by itself. So on issues of climate change, the government needs to come up with measures to ensure that climate change does not adversely affect the rights of others. And lastly, the obligation to fulfill requires the state to take action to facilitate the enjoyment of human rights. So what has the Kenyan government done with regards to climate action, sorry. So first, we have the National Climate Change Response Strategy that was adopted in 2010. In this particular document, the government has put in place the strategies it believes would work in terms of addressing climate change. We also have the Constitution of Kenya, which has a very robust Bill of Rights. And for our topic on issues of environment, we'll look at Article 42 and 43. I saw someone ask a question on class action, on whether people can pursue class action in cases where the violators are non-state actors. And if you look at Article 20 of our Constitution, it's the responsibility not only of the state, but also others to ensure human rights are protected. And that is why, as a country, we say we have the horizontal and vertical application of human rights. We also have the Climate Change Act of 2016. We have the Kenya National Adaptation Plan of 2015 and 2030. We have a sessional paper on climate change policy framework. And these two documents are informed by the Act because it's required by law for the country to have that. And the action plan that is ending in 2022. And in 2016, to affirm our commitments to international obligation, the government signed the nationally determined contribution on how it's going to abate greenhouse emissions by 30% by the year 2030. So this is a requirement by all states to sign, to confirm that they're going to adhere to certain standards to ensure that they abate greenhouse emissions. So this the government has done, and it continues to report on an annual basis what the government is doing to work around climate action. And then lastly, we have the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. You'll allow me to speak about that at length later. This was adopted this year. And again, it talks of the responsibility of the government and also private entities in ensuring that human rights are protected. And from the discussions from Therese and myself, climate change does impact on human rights, and we cannot speak to them in isolation. So the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, as a country, we have a national action plan, and it has 3 key principles. Number 1 is on the state's duty to protect human rights. So that is principle 1. So the state is required to regulate the activities of all corporations, even activities of institutions run by the government, to ensure that they respect human rights. So as a country, I would say we have a number of legislation that works towards protecting environmental rights. So the second UNGP, that's principle 2, is a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So in as much as I said earlier, it's the duty of the state to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. this particular document recognizes that the corporate entities also have a direct impact, their work has a direct impact on issues of human rights. So it requires a non-state agencies, corporations do undertake, it should not just be a CSR. We see institutions going out to do CSR thinking that that is a human rights issue. It requires the non-state agencies, corporate agencies to ensure that they respect human rights. And some of the things the UNGP has proposed, which as a country we have put in the National Action Plan, is that institutions should try and strive to have a human rights policy, conducting human rights due diligence. And I think maybe Emma, in future, you could put a session on how lawyers can assist their clients do human rights diligence, because there is a big business case for agencies when they respect human rights. And lastly, the third pillar is called the access to remedy, where lawyers, I think we fall under this, under the UNGPs. And again, it's referred to as the forgotten pillar, because rarely do people come to this section. When their rights are trampled upon, they rarely go out to seek redress. So it requires the state and also the business agencies themselves to put in place systems that will remedy any human rights violations. So it does recognize both state and non-state dispute resolution mechanisms. So you'll find there are some institutions that have come up with very strong internal systems, so that if cases of any human rights violations occur, then they are able to remedy it at that particular point, as opposed to going to court, which is more expensive. So the other bit I'll speak about is the issue of indivisibility and interdependence of human rights principle. I always feel nice when I see lawyers in their pleadings or submissions, or even when you read judgments from the court, quoting these international documents and even the obligations, such as those we have assigned under the SDGs. So human rights cannot be looked at in isolation. Environmental rights have a direct impact on right to life. Right to health also has link to right to life. So you cannot look at one right in isolation. And if you are to look at the United Nations SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 in number, and those that I believe are linked to issues of climate change are Goal 6, Goal 13, Goal 14, 15, 16, and 17. And I know most of our work as lawyers would be around Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So we cannot look at human rights in isolation, but think about them on how they are interrelated and interdependent. I had this chart to just show you the ecosystem, services, and human rights. So for example, I had the ecosystem service on disease regulation, water quality and quantity, and that is directly linked to the constitutional provision on the right to higher standard of health. So if you're litigating a case on right to health, you can always make reference to how it's going to then impact on the ecosystem services. On accessible and adequate housing, it's a standard of sanitation, issues of wood, flood protection, water quality, directly linked to that particular provision of the Constitution. And then the right to be free from hunger and have adequate food of acceptable quality is directly linked to the ecosystem service of food and soil formation. Right to clean, safe water and adequate quantities. Sorry, to clean and safe water in adequate quantities, it's linked to the ecosystem on water quality and quantity. And lastly, the intertemporal effects. What we are doing now should be sustainable so that the next generation is able to enjoy whatever we will have left for them. So if you look at our constitution, then there is a case on issues of human rights and climate change. So you remember the first chart I had shared on nature's contribution to the people. So if we are able to then do all that is required of us, would be able to enjoy the right to health, right to food, right to adequate standard of living, right to life, and all these things, even right to participate in cultural life. You find there are places that have been affected by deforestation, people are not able to access the forests or certain burial sites. So that then affects right to participate in their cultural rights. So lastly, what the role of lawyers could be in climate change. Number one is capacity enhancement. We need to engage in training opportunities, study, just understand what the laws, policies, or new and emerging issues around climate change. Therese had mentioned we were recently reviewed under the UPR, and there is a report. So create time, look at the review, the feedback we received from our peers on issues of climate change. Look at the concluding observations from the various human rights bodies, the concluding observations with regards to Kenya and issues of climate change. Let us understand what is the role of the duty bearer, that is the government, and the rights of right holders, the role of right holders. So once we do understand the link between the law and climate change, we'll be able to promote climate justice. And I would urge law firms that have capacity around these areas, they can organize training to enhance skills, or even the Law Society can continuously have these sessions. And then the second one is integrating climate action. You'd be surprised that there are certain institutions, they will not touch you as a law firm service provider unless you show them that you have integrated climate action or human rights within your work. So you can yes advise your clients, but even internally, what can you do to promote climate action? So support your clients to develop human rights due diligence, climate change policies, because that is the right way to go, and as lawyers, we should not be left behind. We can also engage in strategic impact litigation. There is a decision that Therese and Immaculate have mentioned, the Owino Uhuru case, in as much as climate action was not mentioned in the case, but we may need to understand that the impact of lead to climate change. So that is important for us to check. We can also check there was a Lamu case around something that was happening in Lamu, but it's a national environmental tribunal that stopped that particular company to commence the project. I'll remember the coal, I think it was coal mining. And then there's also the Kitui case. It wasn't decided on account of climate action, but it was decided on account of lack of public participation. The Mui basis coal mining case. So we can always look through that and see how we can integrate strategic impact. We can integrate human rights in our strategic impact litigation cases on issues of climate change. In addition to the constitutional petition and the strategic impact, we need to also find time to represent environmental human rights defenders. And in Latin America, it's bad where they are killed, they are arrested, trumped up charges. In Kenya, there are also cases of trumped up charges, intimidation of human rights, environmental human rights defenders, because we know they go against the grain. They always want to fight the big companies and not fighting just because they want to fight, because they do understand whatever they are doing may be adversarial to the community. So we need to also reach out to them and support them, the environmental human rights defenders. And lastly is lobbying and advocacy. When laws, policies, and action plans are created, the lawyer's voice should be there. So let's participate. Let's see whether the human rights-based principle, which Therese had mentioned, are inculcated in those particular documents. And allow me to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. I must admit I've learned so much from your presentation as well. And I'm really looking forward to the plenary session. So kindly to our participants, if you have any questions, just feel free to type them on the chat box, or you can raise your hand, then we'll get to you. So our next speaker was to be Clarice Wabua. Unfortunately, she's not with us. I don't know whether she's been able to join. Clarice, are you here? So yeah, Clarice was to talk more about a lawyer's role, especially from a private practice perspective. But I also think Jacqueline has really tried to summarize on her last slide on. So after we've talked about human rights, after we've talked about climate change, what can lawyers do? So just to also go over what she said, I'm told Clarice is here. Okay, just a minute.
I'll ask that she puts her hand up so that you can be able to identify. We have two Janet Nyagas. Kindly try and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I can now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
My apologies. I only now realized that I'm appearing as Janet Nyaga, but this is Clarice speaking. I was unable to unmute, but I think I'm good now. Emma, can I proceed?
So just, I'd like to give you a good introduction. So just give me a minute, I do that.
Okay.
So Clarice is a partner at Cliff Decker and Hofmeier. I hope I'm saying that correctly, incorporating KT Law LLP. She leads the firm on environmental, climate change, and pro bono matters. She's worked as a legal counsel at Carbon Africa, and she previously worked with HHM, and she's now with CDH. Clarice, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Emma, for those kind words and the warm introduction. I'm really delighted to be here with you this afternoon. I could hear you call my name, but I couldn't speak, and I was a bit terrified that I would not have this opportunity to share with you. But we can now proceed. So my role is to speak on climate change, human rights, and a lawyer's role. And the previous speakers, Therese and Jacqueline, have really done such a good job introducing the linkage between climate change and human rights at the international level, and then also the initiatives in Kenya and what it all means for lawyers. So my task is going to be quite simple. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to take you through the rationale for lawyer action, the Kenyan experience, the global practices, and then the road ahead. And this is on the basis that we already know what the linkages between climate change and human rights are. So we'll go straight into then why should lawyers be involved? Why is it important for us to be having this session this afternoon? So the first way we can think about why lawyers should be involved is by conceptualizing it as a lawyer's responsibility towards advancing justice. As has been said by Therese and Jacqueline, developing countries are the most affected by climate change. In fact, statistics are that African countries are only contributing about 2 to 3% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. Yet, it is these developing countries that are most affected. And then even within these countries, it is the persons and groups in vulnerable situations who are even being more adversely affected. And these are like groups like the elderly, children, women. So for that reason, climate change is an urgent justice issue that needs to be addressed. Now, as lawyers, we have always known from our training that a lawyer is and must be the high priest at the shrine of justice. So if we are the high priests at the shrine of justice, we really must be at the forefront in strengthening and upholding the rule of law and respecting human rights. And we can do this by advancing human rights-based measures in how we undertake our work. The second point on justice is that it's not just about how we undertake our work, but also how we are carrying out our personal responsibility as citizens and members of the human race. So it's not enough to advise your clients on climate change matters and how to adapt or mitigate to it. But as businesses, law firms also have a mandate to avoid climate change and to avoid climate-related human rights harm. There's interesting data that shows that law firms are contributing significant amounts of carbon emissions. And in fact, there's research that was carried out in May this year that shows that between 2019 to 2020, the top UK 50 law firms produced high carbon emissions equivalent to nearly 2,000 tanker trunks worth of gasoline from their UK operations. And you can think about how they are doing this. It's probably through air travel, through the use of office equipment that might not be energy efficient, but we will discuss this in later slides. But the important thing to note is that we are emitting highly, and it's not just our clients, but also us as lawyers who have a responsibility. It would be interesting, Emma, maybe if Climate Lawyers Cafe can carry out a similar study for law firms in Kenya to understand how and what impact we are having on this side of the Sahara. In addition to this, the rationale for justice, I would add that if justice is not your concern as a lawyer, though it should be, we could make a case for the economy. As a lawyer, then you'd still be interested in knowing that the economy is doing well because you eat and live in this country. So there's an imperative upon all countries to not only adapt to climate change, but also to mitigate its effects. And what you'll notice is that more and more countries are decarbonizing their economies. And as countries decarbonize, it means that sectors of the economy are being affected. There's that issue of transition. So if you are reliant on the petroleum or coal or fossil fuel sector, there's need to transition to greener fuels. Similarly, the economy is being affected because climate change has an impact on agriculture, it has an impact on tourism, it has an impact on even the food systems. And there's need for adapting to these changes. And as such, lawyers are operating in an economy-wide system that is being affected. So then we need to understand and familiarize ourselves with what climate change and human rights means for us, how it has an impact at an economy-wide scale, and how this affects not just us, but our clients. So whether you're in corporate transactions, corporate commercial affairs, litigation, or whichever other area of legal practice, you need specialist understanding of climate change. And because of our legal training, even if we did not study climate change law at university, and in my time there was no such course, you would be able to have some insights on how you could assist your client. But definitely there's need for more upskilling and capacity building to be able to give more legally tenable solutions. So based on that background, then what is the Kenyan experience towards how lawyers are dealing with climate change? I'll first start off by sharing this slide on, it was by Afrobarometer, and it was checking the status of climate change knowledge in Kenya in 2018. And as you can see on the screen, among the Kenyans who have heard of climate change, 59% were identifying climate change as having adverse weather effects, and they were able to attribute this to human activity. Then more than 9 out of 10 were saying that climate change is affecting their country and their lives, at least a little bit. And then half said it is affecting Kenya a lot. And then majority said we can at least do a little bit to fight climate change. And then 33%, who are less than half, said they can do a lot. So these are ordinary Kenyans who are giving their perspectives on what they can do. The question is, what about lawyers? More recently, if you've been following the news and in the footsteps of the COP and what's been going on at COP26, there's been a lot of news and information on climate change. Every day when you open the newspaper, there's a very high and intense reporting on different aspects of climate change. And that slide is just to share just a few of the headlines or that have been in the different newspapers recently, to show you that this issue is gaining wide attention. Then drawing us to then what can climate change, what can lawyers do, or what have they been doing on their part? What we'll find is that not many lawyers will identify as climate change lawyers in Kenya. However, many, or let me not say many, a number are doing work that has climate change impacts. For example, we have lawyers in human rights. Jacqueline has just given us what the National Human Rights Institution does, which is Kenya Human Rights Commission, and what it does. They receive and investigate complaints, and some of them might be related to climate change abuse. So human rights lawyers then are playing a big role. You have lawyers who are legislative drafting. And if you know what has been happening in Kenya, since 2016, we've had a Climate Change Act. Counties, about 6 counties have Climate Change Acts, and also Climate Change Fund Acts, showing you that at the national level and at the sub-county, sub-national, that is the county level, there's also legislative drafting that is happening. This doesn't happen without lawyers, which means that there are some lawyers involved in this kind of work. Also in the real estate sector, Kenya had listed its first green bond. And this was I think 2 years ago. And this bond was raising 4.3 billion to build the Quillet student hostels. You must be familiar with those, which are green certified. A lawyer must have been involved in the financing of that. So real estate finance lawyers are also working in climate change. Similarly, corporate lawyers are doing carbon contracting type of work. They're also carrying out ESG due diligence. And I think Jacqueline has mentioned human rights due diligence, which is also becoming increasingly common. Kenya has a lot of carbon projects, and this means that there's also been input from lawyers to drive these projects, at least at a contracting level. We have state council who are public lawyers. They're also formulating laws and policies. They're providing legal advice to government, and you'll find quite a number in Glasgow at the COP today, because they're also involved in multilateral environmental agreement negotiations. We have energy lawyers who might not identify as climate change lawyers, but they scope for what they do, because if you're advising on renewable energy, and which is actually the majority of energy currently on our grid, then you are playing a part in undertaking climate action. Similarly, IP lawyers, intellectual property lawyers, when they facilitate the protection of IP rights through the assisting clients with patents, for example, for clean stoves, you're playing your part in climate action as well. Then there are lawyers who do not serve at the bar, but on the bench. So you have the Environmental and Land Court or the National Environmental Tribunal, which has lawyer representation, and they also make decisions. So the Uhuru Owino case has been highlighted by previous speakers. It was heard by the Environment and Land Court. The Lamu Coal case was heard by the National Environmental Tribunal. And as such, even at the bench, there's scope for climate action. Then we have dispute resolution lawyers who offer services on climate litigation, and they could be defending human rights defenders. They could also be challenging government inaction or business inaction. Then we have civil society, like there's organizations like Natural Justice, which is an organization run by lawyers, and they carry out different projects on climate change. And then lastly, but not least, you have lawyers in academia who are maybe lecturing at the university level or polytechnic level, but they're teaching specific courses on climate change or on environmental law, and they're also researching and generating new bodies of knowledge. So what is the legal basis for this action? Is it voluntary? Do lawyers have a voluntary mandate to carry out climate action, or is it mandatory for lawyers to be actively involved? If we look at Article 42 of the Constitution, it guarantees every person the right to a clean and healthy environment, and Article 69 places an obligation on all persons to conserve the environment. Every person and all persons includes lawyers, which means that we have an obligation to conserve and protect the environment. It might not be explicit, but it definitely is there. If you look at the LSK Code of Professional Ethics, it does not explicitly mention sustainability issues or environmental issues, but it places certain overriding principles on lawyers and their professional conduct. And if you look at them carefully, you'd be able to draw parallels to what is needed of a lawyer in the era of climate change. So for example, a lawyer has a duty to have honesty and integrity and exemplify fidelity to the law. Currently, the companies are carrying out climate change initiatives, but there's the element of greenwashing that arises. And you'll find that lawyers may be used to perpetuate that sort of greenwashing, which is where a company is saying that they're doing something for the environment, but in actual fact, it's not. It's sort of derived from the word whitewashing, they're greenwashing. So lawyers have an obligation not to perpetuate such conduct. For example, the code also talks of lawyers being involved in pro bono for public benefit. This is a clear indication that there is need for lawyers to be involved in carrying out pro bono for climate change matters, especially as the link between this and human rights has been established. It means there's more need for pro bono at this level. And then lastly, the basis, I would say, also arises from the UN principles that Jacqueline has introduced. So she said that companies have a duty under these principles to come up with a human rights policy statement, to carry out human rights due diligence, and to remediate impacts. One thing that came out clearly from what she said was that they're not legally binding, but they are guiding principles, and they guide enterprises regardless of size, sector, or geographical location. So if you're a one-man law firm, you cannot say that you don't have an obligation, because regardless of size, you have a duty to observe these human rights principles. And lastly, which she has mentioned, is that there's a national action plan that was developed this year in Kenya, which is important for law firms and lawyers to be familiar with. So then what are the global practices? We've seen what is happening in Kenya. It's important to also look outwards and understand then what are other countries doing? And is there something we can learn from them? So that screen just shows the different initiatives that are initiatives being led by lawyers. We have the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance that was set up just this year, and it's lawyers from international law firms who are trying to accelerate net zero. So they have targets of their own as law firms, and then they are also trying to ensure that the advice they give is leading towards net zero. Then there's a pledge that was set up. It's called the World Lawyers Pledge on Climate Action. I checked today, as of today, there are 600 lawyers who've signed it. And it's like a commitment by the lawyers to integrate climate change concerns and to raise awareness of climate change. Then just last month, the Law Society of England and Wales endorsed a climate change resolution. And under this resolution, they're calling on solicitors and their clients to create a climate conscious approach to legal practice. So it's also available online and might also raise questions as to how the Law Society of Kenya can similarly advance or make such considerations. Then you find lawyers increasingly participating at the conference of the parties and other related events. There are many lawyers and law firms that are hosting panels, conferences, and speaking at the COP at side events. I also observed that international law firms, mainly, I don't know if it's happening in Kenya, but they are appointing heads of sustainability. And these are actually lawyers and partners at the firm who are in charge of sustainability, and their mandate is to ensure that the firm's operations are sustainable. Online, you'll also find the Chancery Lane Project. It's a group of lawyers who are, it's like they are creating documentation, but commercial contracts, but they insert climate-focused clauses. And they are available for other lawyers to use, and that is them doing their part for climate. The American Bar Association has also had some initiative. In 2019, they had a resolution on climate change. And then at their AGM in 2020, they had a panel discussion on climate change. Then lastly, the International Bar Association has also published a climate crisis statement, which I'll share with you in the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the International Bar Association climate crisis statement, and it's calling on lawyers to undertake climate measures in their daily legal practice, to advise clients on the risks and liability and reputational damage that arises from the climate crisis. It calls on lawyers to encourage their clients to voluntarily disclose the risks. And then it also calls on lawyers to engage in climate dispute resolution, specifically on a pro bono, volunteer, and reduced fee basis for those negatively affected by climate crisis. So this ties in with the first slides on what a lawyer can do and what the rationale for it is. So this is my last slide, or last portion of slides, and it's basically tying the different issues I've mentioned, tying them together and then asking, if we had a crystal ball, what are we seeing? What is the road ahead? And the road ahead can be summarized in those two slides. It's saying that climate change will continue to happen, and there'll be both opportunities and challenges, and that law firms will have to be able to embrace the opportunities and will have to be able to mitigate the risks and the challenges. How do we as lawyers know what are the opportunities and where do we find them? Then becomes the key question. And this, the opportunities can be found when you look at international developments. If you look at the Paris Agreement and its requirements, you will note that there are certain things that are expected and required of countries. For example, the NDCs, the countries need to contribute towards reducing emissions, for example. Countries need to adapt to climate change. And then the Paris Agreement also talks about the use of market-based mechanisms under Article 6. It also talks about capacity building and its importance, and the importance of finance flows. And then lastly, the Paris Agreement also talks about the importance of non-state parties being involved. So when you look at this agreement, it tells you that going forward, there's still a lot of scope for lawyers to be involved in these different elements, whether it's technology transfer, market mechanisms, adaptation. There's scope because the Paris Agreement is here to stay. at COP26, what is happening is trying to operationalize some of the elements of the Paris Agreement. And as lawyers, we should also look at what is happening there to understand where are the opportunities. So for example, there's the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, and our country signed it. And the aim of this is to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. This means there's a lot of scope for forestry work, forestry projects. Similarly, there was the global net zero vision that the president unveiled at COP26. And the focus is on water, food and land, energy, built environment. And then lastly, if you look at the COP26 Glasgow Agreement, which should be final at the end of the COP, it then will also tell you where are the opportunities and priority areas. And then I will not go into details about the SDG goals, which Jacqueline mentioned. Safe to say that these also give you an idea that between now and 2030, SDG 13 and the other interrelated goals have a role to play and present opportunities for lawyers. Over and above looking at the international framework, the national, what is going on in Kenya also gives us an indication of where as a lawyer can we plug in. So Kenya had the first Climate Change Act in Africa. This was enacted in 2016. Under this act, there's a lot of responsibilities on the national government, but as also responsibilities on the county governments. So we have 47 counties. It means that there's a place for lawyers at the county level to provide advice to county governments. Then under the Climate Change Act, we have 3 new regulations that have been under development this year. We have the monitoring, reporting, and verification regulations. We have the duties and incentives regulations, and we have the public participation regulations. So these are under draft, but they give you a clear indication that there are going to be responsibilities increasingly being placed upon us and upon our clients. For example, we will soon need to know how to advise clients on monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements under the regulations. We will need to be able to advise on what are the duties that have been placed on private and public entities as well. And then also we'll need to understand the public participation mechanism under law. So those 3 regulations that are coming under the Climate Change Act are also very important to be reviewed and to be understood by lawyers, as they'll be playing a key role as we go on in the next few, I would say few months. Then the updated NDC has been mentioned, so I want to go into details. National Adaptation Plan, National Climate Action Plan have all been mentioned very well by Jacqueline, who has done a good job in going through them. So I will not mention them, safe to say that if you also look at these policy documents, you will understand what are the mitigation areas of priority. For example, blue economy is one, waste, energy, forestry. You'll also understand that market and market-based mechanisms are being prioritized by the Kenyan government, which means that as lawyers, there may be need for more training on carbon markets and the negotiation, drafting of such contracts. Lastly, I'll mention the draft Green Fiscal Incentives Policy Framework, because it's interesting, because it's having this, it talks about a lot of things on how to, on the fiscal incentives framework for Kenya going forward. But some of the things it mentions are the establishment of a Kenya Green Investment Bank, and it also mentions the consideration of the introduction of a carbon tax, which means that then this raises questions for how lawyers need to be prepared to advise on carbon taxes and also the working of this Green Investment Bank. So in a nutshell, I would say WSLD, which is what should lawyers do? Well, based off the presentations before mine and this one, it would be that we should stay abreast of the developments. The climate change space is really evolving very fast. And I've observed it myself because I got into the space in 2009, and it rapidly changes due to international policy and technological advancements, and also as the science improves and changes, as new scientific knowledge comes. So you need to stay abreast to be able to advise a client and to be able to understand what it all means for you. Then we have been told we are the high priests at the altar of justice. Then we need to be at the forefront in seeking remedies for human rights violations, and especially where they're related to climate change. Then another way that lawyers could be involved is by active engagement in shaping laws and policies. And this could be through just sending comments whenever there's a bill that is being developed. So I've shared the 3 bills that are currently under development, and a lawyer can start by sharing their comments on how those bills can be improved. Also at a firm level, law firms should be able to reduce their capacity, reduce their carbon footprint, and also improve their adaptive capacity so that they're able to withstand any climate shocks. Then we have a duty to our clients. We need to be able to provide them with competent advice. And this also comes with staying abreast of the new knowledge. And then lastly, when you're approaching any matter in practice, approach it with the mindset of what does this issue have to do with climate change? How does it have an impact? And what is the human rights angle to this? So if you're advising on a carbon project or even on an energy project, what is the human rights best approach to do it? And that would mean that you also look at the community, how the communities are affected. If you're acquiring land, you look at, has informed consent been granted? So just ensuring that you tweak your practice to also always have in mind the human rights based approach will be beneficial for not just your practice, but also for your country and for the world. And I thank you so much for that. If you like, this is further reading that would help you understand the topic more, and just interesting debates. Some lawyers have been arguing that lawyers do not have a role to play. So it's also interesting to understand those dynamics. Thank you.
Wow, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm feeling very rich with knowledge. Thank you very much for that, Clarice. I mean, I can't believe we almost missed out on this. So from the public sector to the civil society to the private sector, as we've heard from our presenters, there are a lot of numerous opportunities for lawyers to be engaged in climate change, in climate action, and climate justice. So we are taking questions now. If you have a question, just feel free to type in the comment section. We have about 9 minutes remaining, or you can raise your hand and then you can ask your question. We will share the presentations with you all. I see Oliver saying they're feeling energized. So if we do not have any questions, okay, yeah, I can see one hand. Kakai, please proceed.
Okay, thank you so much, Immaculate. And thank you so much to our presenters. I'm feeling quite enlightened on the matters of climate change and human rights and my role as a lawyer. So for me, it's just a suggestion, a comment, or rather a suggestion and one question. So I think the first speaker, I think Jacqueline, mentioned that we can also engage in training of lawyers with regards to matters of climate change. And I think also as a learning friend, I'm not yet a lawyer, so I'm just a learning friend. So as a learning friend, I'd also say that, or I'd rather suggest that we could also start this conversation of climate change among us young lawyers, because you find that for most of us who are still in the process of learning law, we're not really aware of the crisis that we face and the role that we can play. And that's why I would like to also give the suggestion of maybe Immaculate as your organization or LSK can also organize for moot court competitions or research competitions that could help in educating us young lawyers, or rather in helping us to just be aware of the matters around climate change that are surrounding us. Then on to my question now. I think the question of having laws is cannot be answered more, or rather there's not much more ink that is needed to it, because you realize that we have the laws, but then there's the problem that we face of implementation of those laws, because you even see that most people, most speakers have raised the question of, we have the laws have been brought into Kenya, but what about the question of implementation? So my question is regards to the efficacy, how efficient, or rather how effective are the laws that we come up with in ensuring that, you know, carbon emissions are reduced, and also ensuring that states respond to their duties and obligations. Yes, thank you. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Kakai. So I think I'll direct your second question to Clarice, and Jacqueline can weigh in as well. We'll take the second question. I see Janet Olewe, your hand's up.
Yeah, my question is sort of related to Kakai, I believe, if I'm pronouncing it right, to sort of be more specific in terms of the specific areas of climate change in future, perhaps, discussions that would narrow down to the various areas. I'm particular on impacts of climate change, for instance, to water security, because everything else revolves around that. So if maybe for future deliberations, if those could be taken into account, that we would be able to look at specific areas impacted by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. You raised a very important issue. So today's webinar was just, it's an opening session for the Climate Change Lawyers Cafe webinar series, rather called Climate Talks Kenya. So we've taken that into, we've noted that down, and we'll take that into consideration. Oliver, please. Unmute yourself, Oliver. Oliver, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. So as we get to Oliver, I'll request Clarice to respond to Kakai's question on how efficient the laws we come up with are in addressing climate change.
Yeah, I think, Kakai, you've made a very good observation, which is really what is happening at the ground. The problem we have in Kenya is not really a lack of law problem. What we're having is more of an implementation gap problem. There may be laws that structurally have issues. So you can say it's the content that's not right, but there's a lot of effort in lawmaking and the process. And in most cases, our laws are actually quite forward-looking, quite good, but it's at the implementation stage that we falter. I'll give you an example of the Climate Change Act. Just simple things like the Act had mandated certain regulations to be made within a certain time. So for example, we were supposed to have a climate change fund. We were also supposed to, the regulations on duties and incentives for public and private entities were supposed to already have been enacted. So, but they have not yet been enacted. Even the fund is not yet in place. So just at that level, it shows you that we are not complying with the requirements of the mother law at that level of just coming up with regulations. Then even at implementation stage, it's not just the problem of not coming up with regulations, but as a country, we have rule of law issues. And rule of law issues, I would say call them environmental rule of law issues. And there's a report by UNEP from 2019 about environmental rule of law and the gaps in different countries in the world. And you'll find many African countries, and Kenya is also suffering from this, is that we have lack of good governance that trickles down into the environmental sector. You have issues of corruption, which trickle down to the environmental sector. And any other rule of law challenge you can think of that is affecting the country also affects the environmental sector. And because of that, then you have the poor implementation. And then lastly, I would say the capacity on the ground. You know that vitu kwa ground. The capacity on the ground is such that we have good laws, but the people to implement may not always be sufficiently given the capacity. And this would be in terms of the technical skill and also in terms of the financial muscle to be able to implement what they should. In the climate change space, I would give example of counties. Most counties have climate change mandates. They need to have a climate change officer. They need to ensure that they submit their reports on climate change, but they all don't do it, and it could be a capacity issue. They do not have the expertise on the ground, and they do not have the financing. So when you combine all those factors and all those issues, our implementation then suffers. And I think I agree with you that implementation is one of the areas we need to look at very keenly. Emma, I think I've answered that.
Yes, I think you have. Thank you very much for that, Clarence. And Kekai had also asked about initiatives to reach young lawyers. That's also something we are taking into consideration. Actually, the mood, that's an idea we've played around with, but we obviously with the partnership and collaboration of the Law Society of Kenya Nairobi branch or other interested organizations, we can make that a reality. Edward, is Namisi still with us?
Can I respond to the issue of the partnership, Immaculate?
Yes, please.
The young lawyers, yes. As the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights has MOUs with a number of universities, such as University of Nairobi, Kisii University, and Laikipia University. So if you're a member of, if you're a student at any of those universities, you can always reach out to us, and then we can find a way of working at coming up with a moot court or a research, or even just a capacity building session. So that is something that is doable, provided ample notice is given, and I like that idea. On the question of implementation, I know it was directed to the other speaker, but as a human rights practitioner, allow me to say this, that we have the duty bearers, that's the government, and the right holders. So what has been happening across the globe, and I can also give an example for Kenya, is that climate change is yet to be institutionalized in all government agencies. It yes affects all, but it is currently operating under Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. So the operation of the ministry is kind of operating in silos, but are also not in a silo, but I'll also not blame the ministry because there's also the lack of funding. So I would maybe a proposal, just that they're not here. What has institutions such as CAG, the controller of budgets, done that the Ministry of Environment can borrow from? So there has to be capacity enhancement, government agencies. At the same time, the right holders, that's the wananchi, they must be able to then demand from the government. And this can only be done through capacity enhancement by both sectors. That's the duty bearer and the right holder. For now, it's just the right holder, and the right holder, the duty bearer, not all duty bearers, just the Ministry of Environment and select counties, but other ministries are not involved in climate change. So if synergies are not brought to fore, then we'll continue lagging behind in terms of implementation. And I confirm that we have very progressive legislation. If you look at the climate change act, it's very progressive. It's pro the people, makes provisions on public participation and the likes. So it's just an issue of implementation. There has to be capacity enhancement for both the duty bearers and right holders. There is a question that has been placed there on a number of decisions, that if you're aware of any decision. There was one that was mentioned, the Owino Uhuru case in Mombasa. It doesn't really focus more on climate change, but it's an environmental case about lead poisoning. We have the National Environmental Tribunal decision on Lamu case, Lamu coal mining project that was cancelled. And then lastly, the one that I can remember is a new mining project, Mui Basin coal mining project in Kitui, where the court cancelled the process due to lack of public participation. Thank you. And I'm happy to see I call her my baby. I was her pupil master, Lydia Omuko. She's doing her doctorate. If she's not finalized, she's very big on issues of climate change. Good to see you, Lydia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Good to see you, Lydia, as well. Thank you for joining us today and for staying until the close of the webinar. Edward, is Namisi still with us?
Unfortunately, Emma, Helen Namisi had to drop off the call. She had a meeting.
Okay.
Yes, but on behalf of the branch chair and the branch vice chair, we are really grateful for your organization. And I think today, Climate Change Lawyers Cafe has felt the impact of having a conversation about climate change and human rights. And as we sat here, we've learned so much from all the three speakers. I think this is the beginning of more conversations that we will have and a partnership between the two organizations. We also welcome all the advocates who are here and the law students who might have joined us to continue researching more. There were so many links that were sent on the chat section, and we will share today's slides through email. And even more than that, that they can check out the opportunities that are there through our newsletter. Thank you so much, Immaculate, for reaching out to us as a member of the branch and as a young advocate. We feel proud of you and what the work that you're doing, and we'll continue to support you where we can. I wish all the members a good afternoon. I give it back to you, Immaculate, to round up the session.
Thank you, Edward. So thank you for your support as well. Thank you to our panelists who had this idea and they just ran with it. Thank you for believing in that, for setting aside your time to do this with us today. Thank you to all the participants. Being a Friday afternoon, I know it's quite a sacrifice to be here with us today. So please reach out to us on Twitter at Lawyers Climate. I've shared our Twitter handle. Let's keep the conversation going. What we do at the Climate Change Lawyers Cafe is basically to build a lawyer's capacity on matters climate change. connect on available opportunities, and share from experiences. So you're very welcome to connect with us on Twitter, and we'll reach out. So from your comments and observations, you're looking forward to further conversations on this and further engagement, and that's a challenge we're very happy to take up. And we'll reach out because I believe we have your contact information. So thank you very much for this. I call the webinar to close. We look forward to seeing you again. Asanteni sana.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Project one.
Bye bye.
Manual.